A cryptic letter arrives from a dead man, its words a chilling summons. Seek justice where love failed. In the quiet of St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a mind sharper than a blade, is called to unravel a murder that's haunted a family for years. Why has Jason Raphael, a millionaire now gone, chosen her as Nemesis? What secrets lurk among the strangers on a luxury tour of England's grand estates? Chapter 1. The Letter from Beyond the late autumn sun cast a honeyed glow through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, painting delicate shadows across her sitting room. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish, and the crisp tang of October apples piled in a wicker basket by the hearth. Miss Marple, her silver hair neatly pinned, sat in her favourite armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The village outside was quiet, save for the distant chatter of sparrows, but within her, a restless curiosity stirred a sense that something was coming. The postman's knock broke the stillness, sharp and insistent. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her fingers brushing the worn armrest as she rose. At the door, young Tommy, the postman's apprentice, handed her a single envelope, its heavy cream paper sealed with a crimson wax stamp. "Special delivery, Miss Marple," he said, his eyes wide with the importance of his task. "From London," they said, urgent-like. "Thank you, Tommy," she replied, her voice soft but laced with a keen edge. She closed the door, her heart quickening as she studied the envelope. The wax bore the initials J.R. Jason Raphael, the formidable millionaire she'd met years ago in the Caribbean, a man whose sharp mind had matched her own. But Raphael was dead, gone nearly a year. Why now, this letter? In her sitting room, she settled back into her chair, the envelope heavy in her hands. The wax cracked under her careful touch, revealing a single sheet of paper and a smaller, sealed note tucked inside. The handwriting was unmistakably Raphael's, bold, angular, as if carved with purpose. She adjusted her spectacles and began to read. "Dear Miss Marple," it began, "if you are reading this, I am no longer among the living, but my trust in your singular talents remains. You once called yourself Nemesis, a dispenser of justice. I call upon that Nemesis now. A wrong must be righted, a crime uncovered. I cannot name it, for reasons you will discern. Enclosed is a ticket for a tour of Britain's finest houses and gardens, departing in 3 days. Join it, observe. The truth lies among your fellow travellers. Succeed, and £20,000 will be yours. Fail, and a shadow will remain unlifted. Yours, Jason Raphael." Miss Marple's breath caught. The audacity of it a posthumous challenge, vague yet commanding, as if Raphael were playing chess from beyond the grave. She opened a smaller note, which contained only a single word in Raphael's hand, Verity. The name stirred a faint memory, a whisper from their Caribbean encounter, but it slipped away like mist. She leaned back, her mind already spinning threads of possibility. The ticket, tucked within the envelope, was for a luxury coach tour, a winding journey through England's historic estates. It promised elegancy at manor houses, strolls through manicured gardens, but Miss Marple saw past the glossy itinerary. Raphael's game was no holiday. Somewhere on that tour, among strangers, sipping Darjeeling and admiring rosebeds, lurked a secret dark enough to warrant his final act. She rose, crossing to the window, where the village green lay serene under a fading sky. Her reflection gazed back, a small, unassuming figure in a cardigan, yet her eyes gleamed with purpose. Raphael had chosen her, not for strength or youth, but for her quiet gift, the ability to see what others missed, to unravel the human heart's hidden knots, she would not disappoint him. The next morning, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, penning a reply to the tour company to confirm her place. The act felt like signing a contract with fate. As she wrote, her neighbour, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, bustled in, her cheeks flushed from the chilly air. Clara, a widow with a penchant for gossip, carried a tray of homemade scones, their buttery scent filling the room. "Jane, you're looking positively conspiratorial," Clara teased, setting the tray down. "What's that you're writing?" "Not another letter to that vicar about the church fete." Miss Marple smiled, folding the letter away. "Something rather more intriguing, Clara. Tell me, have you ever heard of a man called Jason Raphael?" Clara's brow furrowed. "Raphael sounds familiar. Wasn't he that wealthy gent in the papers last year? Died abroad, didn't he? Owned half of London, they said." "Something like that," Miss Marple murmured, her mind elsewhere. She offered Clara a scone, steering the conversation to village matters, the new butcher's boy, the scandal over Mrs. Price's missing dahlias. But as Clara prattled, Miss Marple's thoughts circled back to Raphael's letter. Verity, the word was a key, but to what lock? That afternoon, she visited the St. Mary Mead Library, a quaint building smelling of old books and wax. Miss Hartnell, the librarian, greeted her with a nod, her pince-nez glinting. "Looking for your usual mysteries, Miss Marple?" "Not today," she replied, her tone light but firm. "I need anything you have on Jason Raphael, newspapers, magazines, anything at all." Miss Hartnell raised an eyebrow, but led her to a stack of archived periodicals. Miss Marple spent hours poring over yellowed pages, her fingers tracing headlines. Raphael's name appeared in Snippett's business deals, and knighthood declined. A brief mention of a troubled son, Michael, whose name sparked another faint Caribbean memory, but nothing mentioned of Verity. The absence was as telling as a clue, suggesting Raphael's mystery was personal, hidden from public eyes. As dusk fell, Miss Marple walked home, the village now cloaked in twilight's hush. The air carried a chill, and she pulled her shawl tighter, her mind racing. Raphael's letter wasn't just a challenge. It was a summons to a battlefield where the weapons were observation and intuition. She imagined the tall strangers with polite smiles, their secrets coiled beneath. One of them, perhaps, was a murderer, or a victim, or both. Back in her cottage, she lit the fire, its crackle a companion to her thoughts. She reread Raphael's letter, her eyes lingering on Nemesis. The name was no accident. In the Caribbean, she'd spoken of justice, of balancing scales. Raphael had remembered, and now he called her to embody it again. The £20,000 was irrelevant. What mattered was the truth he'd entrusted to her. She stood, moving to her small bookshelf, where a worn copy of a Caribbean mystery rested, a memento of that sunlit case. She opened it, hoping for a clue, but found only her own neat handwriting. Trust the heart, not the surface. It was enough. Raphael's trust in her was a torch, and she would carry it as she prepared for bed. The cottage creaked softly, as if sharing her anticipation. She packed a small suitcase, sensible dresses, her knitting, a notebook for observations. The tour began in 3 days, and she would be ready, not as a tourist, but as Nemesis, summoned by a dead man's will. The chapter closed with Miss Marple, standing at her bedroom window, the moon casting a silver glow over St. Mary Mead. She whispered to the night, "Mr. Raphael, I accept your challenge." Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a vow. Tomorrow she would step into the unknown, armed only with her wits and a name, Verity. The game had begun. Chapter 2. The journey begins. The morning air was crisp as Miss Jane Marple stepped onto the cobbled pavement outside the St. Mary Mead post office, her small suitcase in hand. A sleek silver coach, its windows gleaming like polished mirrors, idled at the curb, emblazoned with the words Heritage Horizons, Britain's finest estates. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, tipped his cap as he stowed her luggage. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," he said, his voice warm but clipped, as if guarding his own secrets. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes already scanning the scene. Sharp as a hawk's, she climbed the steps, her sensible shoes tapping softly, and entered a world of plush velvet seats and the faint scent of bergamot from a nearby passenger's perfume. The coach was half full, a mosaic of strangers whose polite nods belied the undercurrents she sensed. Raphael's letter, tucked in her handbag, seemed to hum with purpose. Observe, he'd written, and observe she would. She chose a seat by the window, her knitting bag at her side, and let her gaze drift over her fellow travellers. A woman in a burgundy coat, her hair a cascade of auburn curls, scribbled furiously in a leather journal, pausing only to glance warily at the man across the aisle. He was young, perhaps 30, with a tweed jacket and a nervous habit of twisting a silver ring on his finger. Beside him, an older couple murmured over a guidebook, their faces etched with the comfortable familiarity of long marriage. Each, Miss Marple noted, carried an invisible waiter story untold. The coach rumbled to life, and a tour guide, Miss Evelyn Carver, stood at the front, her crisp navy blazer and bright smile exuding practiced cheer. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear as a bell. "We're bound for the heart of England's history, manners, gardens, and tales of old. Our first stop is Whitestone Hall, where we'll enjoy tea and a private tour. Any questions?" A hand shot up from the back, belonging to a wiry woman with sharp cheekbones and a fox-like glint in her eyes. "Miss Carver, are the rumours true about Whitestone? They say it's haunted." Her tone was half teasing, half probing, and a ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the coach. Evelyn's smile didn't falter. "Mrs. Anthea Bradbury Scott, isn't it? Well, every old house has its stories. We'll let Whitestone speak for itself." She moved on quickly, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of tension in her posture. Anthea Bradbury Scott leaned back, her lips curling in a private smirk, as if she'd scored a point in a game only she understood. The journey unfolded through rolling hills, the landscape a patchwork of emerald fields and stone walls. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm that steadied her thoughts. She overheard snippets of conversation, a retired colonel boasting about his rose garden, a young woman named Joanna complaining about her phone's signal. But it was the woman in the burgundy coat who drew her attention. She introduced herself as Lavinia Glynn, a widow with a gentle voice but eyes that darted like a cornered deer's. "I'm here for the gardens," Lavinia said to no one in particular, yet her fingers clutched her journal as if it held state secrets at a rest stop. Miss Marple found herself beside Lavinia at a tea kiosk, the air thick with the scent of scones and diesel. "You seem fond of writing," Miss Marple ventured, her tone as light as a breeze. "Are you a poet?" Perhaps Lavinia's laugh was brittle. "Hardly. Just notes, memories, you know. I lost someone dear, and writing helps." Her gaze drifted to the horizon, where clouds gathered like unspoken truths. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the tremor in Lavinia's voice. Loss, she knew, could mask many things: grief, guilt, or something darker. Back on the coach, Miss Marple's attention shifted to a man seated alone, his face half hidden by a felt hat. He hadn't spoken, but his hands, calloused and scarred, told a story of hard work or harder fights. When Evelyn announced a detour to a village church, a hidden gem, not on the itinerary, he shifted uncomfortably, his hat tilting to reveal a scar above his brow. Miss Marple's memory stirred. Raphael's son, Michael, had been a troubled soul, tangled in scandal. Could this man be connected? She made a mental note to watch. Him, the church, a squat stone building with ivy-cloaked walls, stood in a hamlet forgotten by time. As the group wandered its tiny graveyard, Miss Marple lingered by a weathered headstone, its inscription barely legible, in memory of one loved. The words tugged at her, echoing Raphael's cryptic verity. She glanced at Anthea Bradbriscott, who stood apart, her fingers tracing a locket at her throat. Their eyes met, and Anthea's widened briefly before she turned away, her steps quickening toward the coach. Inside the church, Miss Marple sat in a pew, the cool wood grounding her thoughts. The young man in tweed, who introduced himself as Oliver Trent, approached, his ring-twisting habit more pronounced. "Odd place for a stop, don't you think?" he said, his voice low. "Evelyn's hiding something. That church wasn't on the brochure." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild. Perhaps she's indulging a whim, or perhaps there's a purpose we don't yet see. Oliver frowned, unconvinced, but said no more. His suspicion, she noted, was a mirror to her own, as the coach rolled toward Whitestone Hall. The sky darkened, promising rain. Evelyn shared tales of the estate's history: a duel in 1803, a lost heirloom, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She recalled Raphael's letter, its weight in her handbag a constant reminder. The truth lies among your fellow travellers. Was it Lavinia, guarding her journal like a fortress? Anthea, with her sly glances and hidden locket? Or the scarred man, silent as a shadow? At Whitestone Hall, the group disembarked into a courtyard framed by ancient oaks. The manor loomed, its stone facade both grand and forbidding. As they awaited tea, Miss Marple overheard Anthea whispering to Lavinia, her voice sharp as a blade. "You shouldn't have come, Lavinia. Not after what happened." Lavinia paled, her journal slipping to the grass. Miss Marple bent to retrieve it, but Lavinia snatched it back, her eyes wide with panic. Tea was served in a gilded drawing room, the clink of china mingling with polite chatter. Miss Marple sipped her Earl Grey, her gaze flitting from face to face. The Colonel droned on. About roses, Joanna scrolled her phone in vain, and the scarred man stared out a window, his reflection a mask of unease. Evelyn, ever the hostess, circulated with a tray, but her smile grew strained when Anthea asked about a locked wing of the manor. "Private quarters," Evelyn said curtly. "Off limits." The chapter closed as Miss Marple stood by a rosewood table, her knitting untouched. She felt the threads of Raphael's mystery tightening: Lavinia's secrets, Anthea's taunts, the scarred man's silence, Evelyn's evasions. Each was a piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. As rain began to patter against the manors windows, she murmured to herself, "The game is afoot, Mr. Raphael." Her heart thrummed with purpose, ready to unravel the truths hidden among these strangers. Chapter 3. Whispers of Verity. The coach wound through a valley dappled with morning mist, its tires humming a steady tune as Miss Jane Marple gazed out at the patchwork of hedgerows and distant spires. The air inside was warm, tinged with the faint sweetness of lavender from a sachet someone had tucked into a seat. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, her fingers still as her mind sifted through the faces and fleeting glances of her fellow travellers. Raphael's directive observer like a pulse, and yesterday's tea at Whitestone Hall had sharpened her senses. Lavinia's guarded journal, Anthea's cryptic locket, the scarred man's silence, each was a thread in a tapestry she couldn't yet read. The tour's second stop was Ashford Priory, a crumbling estate famed for its rose gardens and tragic history. As the coach pulled into the gravel drive, Miss Evelyn Carver, the guide, stood with her clipboard, her smile as polished as ever. Ashford Priory, she announced, her voice carrying over the rustle of coats, a jewel of the 17th century, though its owners met rather unfortunate ends. We'll explore the grounds, then gather for luncheon in the orangery. Miss Marple stepped onto the drive, her sensible shoes crunching against the stones. The Priory loomed, its ivy-clad towers clawing at a sky heavy with clouds. The group dispersed, some drawn to the roses, others to the Gothic arches of the main hall. She lingered near a fountain, its water murmuring like a secret, and noticed a new face among the travellers, an older woman, tall and stately, with silver hair swept into a bun and eyes that held the weight of years. She introduced herself as Elizabeth Temple, a retired headmistress, her voice low and resonant, like a cello's hum. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you?" Elizabeth said, approaching with a measured step. "Evelyn mentioned you're from St. Mary Mead, a quiet place, I imagine, but no stranger to secrets." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Villagers are much like people, Miss Temple. They where they're calm like a mask." Her eyes met Elizabeth's, sensing a kindred spirit, one who saw beyond surfaces. They walked together toward the rose garden, where petals glowed crimson and gold under the muted light. Elizabeth paused by a thorned bush, her fingers brushing a bloom. "Roses remind me of a girl I once knew," she said softly. "Verity Hunt. She loved gardens like this. Such a bright soul," until her voice trailed off and her hand fell, as if the memory were a weight too heavy to hold. Miss Marple's heart quickened, the name Verity striking like a bell. Raphael's note had carried that word, a single clue in his cryptic game. "Verity Hunt," she repeated gently. "A name that carries sorrow, I think." Elizabeth's eyes darkened, and she nodded. She was a pupil of mine, years ago. Brilliant, kind, but caught in a love that turned sour. They found her body in a ditch, not far from here. Murdered the boy they blamed Michael Raphael was her fiancé, a tragedy that broke too many hearts. The air seemed to thicken, the fountain's murmur now a distant drone. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting Raphael's letter to this revelation. Michael, his son, accused of murder. Yet Elizabeth's tone held a note of doubt, as if the story were incomplete. "You don't believe he did it," Miss Marple said. Not a question, but an observation. Elizabeth's gaze was steady. "Love can wound, Miss Marple, but it doesn't always kill." Verity's death felt orchestrated, as if someone wanted the world to look away. She hesitated, then added, "Be careful on this tour. Some truths are buried for a reason." Before Miss Marple could press further, a shout broke the moment. Oliver Trent, the young man with the silver ring, stood by the Priory's east wing, waving excitedly. "Look at this," he called, pointing to a stone plaque half hidden by ivy. The group gathered, curious, and Miss Marple joined them. Noting Anthea Bradbury Scott's absence, she was lingering by the coach, her locket glinting as she whispered to Lavinia Glynn. The plaque bore an inscription, to Verity, forever in bloom, 1953 to 1970. A murmur rippled through the group. Joanna, the young woman obsessed with her phone, gasped. That's creepy. Wasn't she the girl who got killed? Why's her name here? Evelyn stepped forward, her smile strained. A memorial, nothing more. The Hunt family were patrons of Ashford. Shall we move to the orangery? Her haste to redirect was palpable, and Miss Marple filed it away, her eyes lingering on the plaque. Verity's name, carved in stone, felt like a challenge from Raphael himself. The orangery was a glass-walled haven, fragrant with citrus and warm. Bread. As the group settled at long tables, Miss Marple chose a seat near Elizabeth, who now seemed withdrawn, her earlier warmth dimmed. Across the room, the scarred man still nameless sat in silence, his hat pulled low. Miss Marple noticed Lavinia watching him, her journal open but untouched, her pen trembling slightly. During luncheon, the Colonel, whose name was revealed as Major Percy, regaled the table with tales of his military days, but Miss Marple's attention was on a whispered exchange between Evelyn and a grand. The man, wiry and weathered, gestured toward a locked gate at the garden's edge, his voice low. No one goes there, miss, not since the trouble. Evelyn's nod was curt, but her eyes flicked to the group, as if checking Hood overheard. After lunch, Miss Marple slipped away to explore the locked gate, her curiosity outweighing caution. It was iron, rusted but sturdy, leading to a shadowed path overgrown with brambles. A faint scent of decay lingered, and she spotted a faded ribbon tied to a branch, its blue hue dulled by time. Her fingers brushed it, and a chill ran through her, not from the air, but from the sense that Verity's shadow lingered here. Returning to the group, she found Anthea by the fountain, alone. "You're a curious one, Miss Marple," Anthea said, her voice sharp as cut glass, "poking about where you shouldn't. Some stones are best left unturned." Her locket gleamed, and Miss Marple glimpsed an initial etched on it, V, I find. "Stones often hide the truth," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but her eyes piercing. Anthea's smirk faltered, and she turned away, her footsteps quick and uneven. As the coach prepared to depart, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resumed but her mind far from the stitches. Elizabeth's story of Verity, the plaque, the locked gate, Anthea's locket-all, were pieces of Raphael's puzzle, each edged with danger. She recalled Elizabeth's warning. Some truths are buried for a reason. Yet Raphael had summoned her as Nemesis, and she would not shy from the task. The chapter closed as the coach rolled away from Ashford Priory, the mist now a shroud over the valley. Miss Marple clutched her handbag, feeling the weight of Raphael's letter within. Verity Hunt's name was no longer just a clue, it was a cry for justice, and she would answer it. Her lips moved silently, a promise to the dead. "I will find you, Verity." Chapter 4. The Sister's Secret. The coach rolled away from Ashford Priory, leaving its mist-shrouded towers behind, but Miss Jane Marple's thoughts lingered on Verity Hunt's name, carved in stone and whispered by Elizabeth Temple. The evening sky bruised purple as the tour reached a crossroads, where Lavinia Glynn, her auburn curls tucked under a scarf, approached Miss Marple with an unexpected offer. "My sisters and I have a house nearby, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but strained. "We'd be delighted if you'd stay with us for a night or two. The tour's next stop is close, and, well, we'd enjoy the company." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, sensing an opportunity cloaked in courtesy. "How kind," Mrs. Glynn. I'd be delighted. She noted Lavinia's fleeting glance toward Anthea Bradbury Scott, who stood by the coach, her locket catching the last light like a warning beacon. The manor, Old Hall, squatted at the edge of a village called Lichgate, its stone walls draped in wisteria that seemed to choke rather than adorn. As Miss Marple stepped from the hired car Lavinia had arranged, the air carried a damp chill, laced with the scent of moss and something faintly sour, like forgotten fruit. Lavinia led her inside, where a cavernous hall greeted them, its oak beams looming like the ribs of some ancient beast. A fire crackled in a vast hearth, but its warmth barely reached the shadows. Lavinia's sisters awaited them, Clotilde Bradbury-Scott. The eldest was tall and imposing, her dark hair streaked with silver, her eyes warm yet piercing, as if measuring Miss Marple's soul. Anthea, the youngest, flitted about like a nervous moth, her thin hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "Welcome to Old Hall," Clotilde said, her voice rich as velvet. "It's rare we have guests. You must tell us about your village st. Mary Mead, is it?" Over a supper of roast pheasant and spiced pears, Miss Marple spun tales of village life, her words light but her gaze sharp, noting every detail. Clotilde's attentive nod, Lavinia's untouched plate, and Thea's habit of glancing at a locked door across the hall. The conversation turned to the tour, and Miss Marple mentioned Ashford Priory's memorial plaque. "Verity Hunt," she said casually, watching their faces. "A sad story, I'm told." Clotilde's fork paused mid-air, her smile tightening. "A tragedy, yes. She was dear to us. We knew her as a child." Lavinia's eyes dropped to her lap, and Anthea's handkerchief tore slightly under her grip. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the fire's snap after supper. Lavinia offered to show Miss Marple the grounds. The night was moonless, the garden a maze of yew hedges and skeletal trees. Lavinia's lantern cast flickering shadows, and her voice, usually gentle, carried a tremor. "This place holds memories," she said, pausing by a stone bench. "Verity used to sit here, sketching. She was like a sister to us, before." She stopped, her breath catching. "Before her death," Miss Marple finished softly, her tone inviting trust. Lavinia nodded, her eyes glistening. It broke Clotilde most of all. She raised Verity after her parents died, loved her like a daughter. The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple sensed a truth unspoken, a fracture beneath Lavinia's grief. Returning to the house, Miss Marple excused herself to explore the library, a musty room lined with leather-bound tomes. A portrait hung. Above the fireplace, a young woman with chestnut hair and a wistful smile, her eyes hauntingly familiar. The frame bore a nameplate, Verity Hunt, 1968. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Raphael's clue, Verity, was no coincidence. This house was its heart, as she examined the portrait. A floorboard creaked behind her. Anthea stood in the doorway, her face pale as bone. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, her voice a mix of fear and venom. "Some things are private." Her locket swung as she turned, revealing a faint engraving, a rose entwined with a V. Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "Forgive an old woman's curiosity. Verity was lovely, wasn't she?" Anthea's lips quivered, but she said nothing. Fleeing down the hall, Miss Marple lingered, her fingers tracing the portrait's frame. A faint seam suggested a hidden compartment, but before she could investigate, Clotilde appeared, her presence filling the room. "You've found our Verity," she said, her tone warm but edged with steel. She was our light. Her loss changed us. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Clotilde's love for Verity was palpable, but there was something possessive in her gaze, a shadow that didn't align with simple grief. Loss can linger like a ghost, Miss Marple said, watching Clotilde's reaction. The older woman's smile faltered, and she gestured toward the stairs. "It's late, Miss Marple. Your room is ready." The guest room was austere, its windows overlooking a neglected corner of the garden where a stone structure, a greenhouse, perhaps stood shrouded in ivy. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched, her thoughts weaving a pattern. Verity's portrait, Anthea's locket, Clotilde's intensity, each was a clue, but the picture remained incomplete. Raphael's game was here, in this house. Among these sisters, a soft knock interrupted her reverie. Lavinia entered, carrying a cup of chamomile tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, her smile hesitant. "Old Hall can feel oppressive at night." She lingered, as if wanting to say more, then whispered, "Be careful, Miss Marple. Not everything here is what it seems." Alone. Again, Miss Marple sipped the tea, its warmth a contrast to the chill in her bones. She recalled Elizabeth Temple's words at Ashford. Verity's death felt orchestrated. The sisters' connection to Verity was no coincidence, and hostility suggested a secret guarded fiercely. She crossed to the window, peering at the greenhouse. A faint light flickered within, brief as a firefly, then vanished. Her heart thumped. Someone was there, in the dark. She considered investigating, but chose caution, locking her door instead. Raphael's letter, tucked in her handbag, seemed to pulse with urgency. "The truth lies among your fellow travelers," he'd written, and now the sisters were part of that circle. Clotilde's devotion, Lavinia's fear, Anthea's defiance, each was a piece of Verity's story, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. The chapter closed as Miss Marple sat on the edge of her bed, the manor's silence broken by a distant creak, like a secret stirring. She whispered to the night, "Verity, I'm closer now." Her voice was soft, but it carried the steel of Nemesis, ready to unearth the truth hidden in Old Hall's shadowed heart. Chapter 5. The Roxladeth morning sun struggled through a veil of clouds as Miss Jane Marple rejoined the Heritage Horizons tour, her suitcase lighter but her mind heavy with the secrets of Old Hall, the flickering light in the greenhouse. Anthea's locket, Clotilde's possessive gaze, they wove a web around Verity Hunt's name, each strand taut with hidden meaning. Raphael's letter, tucked in her handbag, urged her onward. "The truth lies among your fellow travelers." As the coach wound through the rugged hills of Lichgate's outskirts, she felt the weight of her task as Nemesis. Today's itinerary was a hike through Blackthorn Ridge, a craggy stretch of moorland dotted with ancient stones and wild heather. Miss Evelyn Carver, the tour guide, stood at the trailhead, her navy blazer slightly rumpled but her smile as bright as ever. A brisk walk to stretch the legs, she called, her voice cutting through the wind's low moan. "Stay on the path and mind the loose rocks. We'll picnic by the old quarry." Miss Marple, in her sturdy walking shoes, trailed the group, her knitting bag slung over one shoulder. The air was sharp, scented with earth and gorse, and the ridge rose before them like a giant's spine. Elizabeth Temple, the retired headmistress, walked nearby, her silver hair catching the light as she leaned on a carved walking stick. "You've been with the sisters," Elizabeth said, her tone low, probing. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. but her reply was guarded. Old houses have long memories, Miss Temple, they whisper, if you listen. Elizabeth's lips parted, as if to speak, but a shout from ahead interrupted. Oliver Trent. The young man with the silver ring pointed to a circle of standing stones, their surfaces etched with weathered runes. Look at this. Druid stuff, maybe. His excitement drew the group, but Miss Marple noted the scarred man still nameless lingering at the edge, his eyes scanning the cliffs above. The path narrowed as they climbed, the terrain growing treacherous. Lavinia Glynn walked alone, her burgundy coat a splash of colour against the grey rocks, her journal clutched like a shield. Anthea Bradburgh Scott, however, was animated, her usual nervousness replaced by a restless energy. She darted between rocks, pointing out wildflowers with a laugh that felt forced. Verity loved places like this, she said to no one in particular, her voice carrying on the wind. Miss Marple's ears pricked Anthea's mention of Verity. Was too casual, too deliberate. Halfway up the ridge, the group paused at a lookout, the valley sprawling below like a quilt stitched with green and gold. Elizabeth Temple stood apart, her gaze distant. Miss Marple approached, sensing a moment to probe. You spoke of Verity's love turning sour, she said softly. Was there someone else, besides Michael Raphael, who might have resented her? Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, but before she could answer, a low rumble shook the ground. Pebbles skittered down the slope, and a cry rang out. Look out! It was Major Percy, the colonel, pointing upward. A cascade of rocks, some as large as barrels, tumbled from the cliff above, a roaring tide of stone. The group scattered, screams piercing the air. Miss Marple gripped a boulder, her heart pounding as dust clouded her vision. When the chaos settled, a terrible stillness followed. Elizabeth Temple lay crumpled at the path's edge, her walking stick broken beside her, blood trickling from a gash on her temple. Evelyn knelt beside her, her face pale. She's alive, but we need help. The scarred man, surprisingly swift, was already sprinting toward the coach for a first aid kit, his hat lost in the rush, revealing a face weathered by more than time. Miss Marple's mind raced, her calm exterior belying her suspicion. The rocks hadn't fallen by chance, their path was too precise, their timing too perfect. She scanned the cliff, spotting a disturbed patch of earth where stones had been pried loose. Someone had orchestrated this, and Elizabeth's words about Verity made her a target. As the group rallied, Joanna, the phone-obsessed young woman, sobbed, clutching Oliver's arm. It could have been any of us, she wailed. Oliver, his ring-twisting habit frantic, muttered, This isn't right. First that plaque, now this. Miss Marple noted his unease, wondering if his suspicion mirrored her own. A local ranger arrived, summoned by Evelyn's radio, and Elizabeth was carried to a makeshift stretcher. She's concussed, maybe worse, the ranger said, his voice grim. Hospital's the best bet. As they moved her to a waiting ambulance, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Anthea, standing apart, her locket clutched tightly. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment, fear flickered across her face before she turned away. At the hospital, a sterile room hummed with the beep of monitors. Miss Marple sat by Elizabeth's bed, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm to anchor her thoughts. The doctor, a young woman with tired eyes, reported a severe concussion and possible skull fracture. She's stable, but not conscious. It's touch and go. Miss Marple nodded, her mind elsewhere, piecing together the day's events. She recalled a moment on the hike, just before the rock slide, when Lavinia had lagged behind, her gaze fixed on the cliff. Had she seen something or someone? The scarred man's swift action, too, was curious. His scars suggested a past of violence, yet his urgency to help was genuine. And Anthea's mention of Verity, so pointed, felt like a taunt, a dare to dig. Deeper, a nurse interrupted, handing Miss Marple a small item found in Elizabeth's coat. A folded sketch, yellowed with age, depicting a rose garden with two figures, one labelled VH in a childish scrawl. Miss Marple's breath caught Verity. Hunt, again. The second figure was unlabelled, but its posture, defiant and tall, reminded her of Clotilde Bradburgh Scott. She tucked the sketch into her handbag, next to Raphael's letter, its weight a reminder of her mission. As night fell, the hospital grew quiet, the corridors dim. Miss Marple stood by a window, watching storm clouds gather over Lichgate. The rockslide was no accident, and Elizabeth's knowledge of Verity's death had made her a threat. Someone on this tall Lavinia, Anthea, the scarred man, perhaps even Evelyn, knew more than they let on. Raphael's game was growing deadly, and Miss Marple felt its stakes in her bones. She leaned closer to Elizabeth's bedside, her voice a whisper. "You tried to tell me something, didn't you? About Verity, about love and betrayal. I'll find it, I promise." Her words were a vow, soft but unyielding, as lightning cracked the sky outside. The chapter closed with Miss Marple stepping into the storm, her umbrella raised like a shield. Her heart set on uncovering the truth behind the rocks that had nearly silenced a witness to Verity's past. Chapter 6. A voice from the grave. The hospital in Lichgate buzzed with the quiet urgency of a place where life and death held court. Miss Jane Marple sat by Elizabeth Temple's bedside, her knitting needles silent in her lap, the sterile air sharp with antiseptic. Outside, dawn painted the sky a fragile pink, but inside, the dim glow of monitors cast shadows across Elizabeth's pale face. The rock slide on Blackthorn Ridge had left her comatose, a silent witness to Verity Hunt's tragedy, and Miss Marple felt the weight of Raphael's mission pressing harder. His letter tucked in her handbag seemed to whisper, "The truth lies among your fellow travellers." But who among them had loosened those stones? A soft moan broke her thoughts. Elizabeth's eyelids fluttered, her lips parting as if testing the air. Miss Marple leaned forward, her heart quickening. "Miss Temple," she whispered, her voice a gentle tether. Elizabeth's eyes opened, clouded but fierce, and her hand grasped Miss Marple's with surprising strength. "Search for Verity." "Hunt," she rasped, each word a laboured breath. "Not what they say." Her gaze darted to the door, fear flickering, then her eyes closed, and she sank back into silence. Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. Elizabeth's words were a spark in the dark, confirming Verity's death was no simple crime. Not what they say. Did she mean Michael Raphael's guilt was a lie? Or was there another layer, a deeper deception? The sketch from Elizabeth's coat, Verity, and an unnamed figure in a rose garden lay, heavy in her handbag. A clue that demanded answers. As she pondered, a nurse entered, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum. "A delivery for you, Miss Marple," she said, handing over a small envelope. It bore no stamp, only her name in a familiar, angular script. Jason Raphael's. Miss Marple's breath caught. How had it reached her here, in this remote hospital? She thanked the nurse and, alone again, broke the seal. Inside was a single card. "Seek justice where love failed. Trust your instincts, Nemesis." No signature, but Raphael's voice echoed in every word, as if he stood beside her, guiding her through the fog. She tucked the card away, her resolve hardening. Elizabeth's whisper and Raphael's message were twin beacons, pointing to the Bradbury Scott sisters' manor. Clotilde's possessive love for Verity, Anthea's guarded locket, Lavinia's trembling fear they were not mere mourners. One, or all, held the key to Verity's fate. Miss Marple glanced at Elizabeth, her face now serene in sleep, and murmured, "I'll keep my promise." Leaving the hospital, she rejoined the tour group at a nearby inn, where the mood was somber. The rock slide had rattled them, and whispers of bad luck rippled through the dining room, where breakfast was served under low beams. Miss Marple took a seat near Lavinia Glynn, whose auburn curls were pinned tightly, as if to hold her composure in place. "How is Miss Temple?" Lavinia asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her journal absent for once, clinging to life. Miss Marple replied, watching Lavinia's fingers tighten around her teacup. She spoke of Verity Hunt, a name that seems to haunt this tour. Lavinia's eyes flicked up, then away, a deer startled by a hunter's step. "It's a sad story," she murmured, but her tone carried a weight Miss Marple couldn't yet decipher. Across the room, Anthea Bradbriscott sat with Major Percy, her laughter sharp and brittle as she recounted a tale of a lost brooch. Miss Marple noted the locket at her throat, its rose and V engraving catching the light. Anthea's gaiety felt like a mask, and when their eyes met, her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of defiance. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind tracing the sisters' connections to Verity. Each gesture a clue in Raphael's deadly game. The scarred man, whom she'd overheard called Gabriel by the innkeeper, sat alone, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. His scars, stark in the morning light, told a story of survival, but his eyes avoided hers, as if he sensed her scrutiny. Could he be Michael Raphael, the accused lover, or another player in this shadowed drama? Miss Marple made a mental note. To learn more, Evelyn Carver announced the day's plan, a visit to a nearby abbey. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She slipped outside, where the inn's garden offered solitude. A stone path led to a pond, its surface rippled by a breeze, and there she found Oliver Trent, the young man with the silver ring, tossing pebbles into the water. "You're always watching, aren't you?" he said, not turning, "like you see things we don't." Miss Marple smiled, her tone light. "An old habit, Mr. Trent. People are like books full of stories, if you know where to look." He tossed another pebble, his ring glinting. "That rock slide wasn't natural," he said quietly. "I saw dirt piled up, like someone dug at the cliff. You think it's tied to that Verity girl?" Her heart skipped, but her face remained serene. "Perhaps," she said. "Truth has a way of surfacing, like those ripples." Oliver's frown deepened, and he walked away, leaving her to ponder his words. A deliberate rock slide meant intent murderous intent, and Elizabeth's knowledge had made her a target. Back inside, Miss Marple overheard a hushed exchange between Evelyn and the innkeeper, a stout woman with wary eyes. "No one's been up that ridge in weeks," the innkeeper said. "If those rocks were moved, it wasn't locals." Evelyn's nod was curt, her clipboard clutched like a shield. Miss Marple filed this away, sensing Evelyn's role in the tour was more than it seemed. As the group boarded the coach, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drawn to a narrow alley beside the inn. A glint of metal caught her ajar small knife, its blade etched with a rose, half buried in the dirt. She bent to retrieve it, careful not to touch the handle, and wrapped it in her handkerchief. The rose matched Anthea's locket, a connection too precise to ignore. She slipped the knife into her handbag, next to Raphael's card and Elizabeth's sketch. Each item a piece of the puzzle. The coach rumbled toward the Abbey. But Miss Marple's thoughts were back at Old Hall, its shadowed greenhouse and Verity's portrait. Elizabeth's gasps, search for Verity, Hunter Code Raphael's call to seek justice. The sisters, the scarred man, Oliver's suspicion, Evelyn's evasions. They were all threads in a tapestry of deceit, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it. The chapter closed as the coach crested a hill, the Abbey's spires piercing the clouds. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Elizabeth's voice, frail yet fierce, lingered in her ears, a cry from the grave. "I hear you, Verity," she whispered, her voice steady as steel, "and I'm coming for the truth." Chapter 7. The Archdeacon's Tale. The Abbey's ancient stones loomed against a sky heavy with unshed rain, their weathered faces whispering of centuries past. Miss Jane Marple stepped from the coach, her umbrella clutched like a scepter, her mind ablaze with the fragments of Raphael's puzzle. Elizabeth Temple's gasped words, search for Verity, hunt, and the rose-etched knife in her handbag were sparks in a tinderbox, igniting her resolve. The tour group, still shaken by the rock slide on Blackthorn Ridge, moved sluggishly, their chatter muted as they entered the Abbey's cloister, where ivy clung like secrets to the walls. Miss Marple's eyes scanned her fellow travellers. Lavinia, Glynn, her journal now a constant shadow. Anthea Bradbury-Scott, her locket a glinting enigma. Gabriel, the scarred man, whose silence was a fortress. Raphael's latest message, seek justice, where love failed, echoed in her mind, a call to unravel the truth hidden among them. The Abbey, with its vaulted ceilings and hushed reverence, felt like a stage for revelation. As the group gathered in the nave, Miss Evelyn Carver introduced a guest speaker, Archdeacon Brobazon, a stooped figure with a mane of white hair and eyes that gleamed with quiet wisdom. "He'll share the Abbey's history," Evelyn said, her clipboard clutched tightly, as if anchoring her to routine. But Miss Marple noted a tremor in her voice, a crack in her polished facade. The Archdeacon's voice, rich and resonant, filled the stone chamber. He spoke of monks and martyrs, of a hidden crypt beneath the altar. But Miss Marple's attention sharpened when he paused, his gaze lingering on the group. "This Abbey was a place of vows," he said, "some kept, some broken. I once came here to perform a secret marriage for a young couple whose love defied the world, but they never arrived." Miss Marple's heart quickened, sensing a thread. To Verity, she approached him after the talk, as the group dispersed to explore the Abbey's gardens. "A secret marriage," she said, her tone light but probing. "A rare thing, Archdeacon. Might I ask their names?" Brabazon's eyes met hers, searching as if weighing her intent. "Verity Hunt and Michael Raphael," he said softly. "They were to meet me here in the spring of 1970. Verity was radiant, full of hope, but Michael, he was troubled, yet devoted. They never came. I learned later she was found dead, and he was blamed." The words landed like stones in a still pond. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the Archdeacon's tale to Elizabeth Temple's warning. Not what they say. Michael's guilt was the accepted story, but Brobazon's account suggested otherwise. Did anyone know of their plan? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm in her thoughts. "Only a few," he replied, his brow furrowing. Verity's guardian Clotald Bradbury Scott was fiercely protective. I sensed she disapproved, though she never said so directly. His voice dropped, barely a whisper. There was a shadow over that family, Miss Marple. Something unspoken. She thanked him, her mind alight with new possibilities. Clotilde's love for Verity, described by Lavinia as maternal, now seemed tinged with control. Had she known of the secret wedding? Had she acted to stop it? Miss Marple glanced at the group, spotting Clotilde herself, who had joined the tour that morning, her tall frame commanding as she spoke with Evelyn near a rose window. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and a chill passed between them, as if Clotilde sensed her scrutiny. In the Abbey's garden, Miss Marple found a quiet bench, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and lavender. She opened her handbag, examining the rose-edged knife and Elizabeth's sketch, the latter showing Verity with a figure resembling Clotilde. The Archdeacon's story added a new layer. Verity's love for Michael had threatened someone's hold over her. Miss Marple's fingers brushed Raphael's card. Its words seek justice where love failed now, a beacon pointing to Clotilde. A rustle broke her reverie. Oliver Trent, his silver ring catching the light, approached, his face taut with unease. "You were talking to the Archdeacon," he said, his voice low. "About that Verity girl, I bet. I overheard Evelyn arguing with someone last night, something about keeping the past buried. She's nervous. Miss Marple's smile was disarming. People often are when the past stirs. Mr. Trent, did you hear who she spoke to?" Oliver shook his head, his ring-twisting habit betraying his nerves. Couldn't tell, but it was heated. This tour's got ghosts, and not the Abbey kind. His words lingered as he walked away, and Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Anthea, who stood by a yew tree, her locket clutched tightly. She was whispering to Lavinia, whose journal lay open on a stone table, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft as a cat's. "A lovely spot," she said, nodding at the garden. Verity must have cherished places like this. Anthea's hand froze on her locket, her eyes narrowing. "You keep mentioning her," she snapped, her voice sharp as flint. "Why do you care about a dead girl?" Lavinia's head jerked up, her journal snapping shut, and Miss Marple noted the panic in her eyes. "Curiosity is an old woman's vice," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her gaze piercing. "And Verity's name seems to follow us." Anthea's lips tightened, and she stormed off, leaving Lavinia to murmur an apology before following. The exchange, brief but electric, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. The sisters were guarding more than grief. As the group prepared to leave the Abbey, Miss Marple lingered in the cloister, where a small shrine held a candle, its flame flickering in the draught. Beside it was a guest book, its pages filled with visitors' names. She flipped through, pausing at an entry from 1970. "For Verity, with love, CBS, Clotilde Bradbury Scott." The date was weeks before Verity's death, a silent cry from the past. Miss Marple's fingers traced the ink, her mind weaving a new thread. Clotilde's love for Verity was a chain, and its breaking had led to tragedy. The coach awaited, its engine a low growl. Gabriel, the scarred man, stood by the door, his eyes scanning the group as if searching for a threat. Miss Marple caught his gaze, and for a moment she saw not fear but recognition, as if he knew her purpose. Could he be Michael, hiding in plain sight? She filed the thought away, her handbag heavier with each Clutha knife. The sketch, Raphael's card, and now this guest book entry. As the coach rolled toward, The next stop, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched. The Archdeacon's tale had shifted the puzzle, casting doubt on Michael's guilt and light on Clotilde's role. Love, not hate, might have driven Verity's killer, and Clotilde's shadow loomed large. The abbey spires faded behind them, but their secrets followed, woven into the tour's very fabric. The chapter closed as Miss Marple whispered to herself, her voice a soft vow in the hum of the coach. Verity, your love was a spark. I'll find who snuffed it out. Her eyes gleamed with the steel of Nemesis, ready to face the darkness ahead. Chapter 8. Shadows in the Greenhouse. Dusk air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth as Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of Old Hall's garden. Her eyes fixed on the greenhouse she'd glimpsed from her guest-room window. The tour had returned to Lichgate for an unscheduled stop, prompted by Evelyn Carver's vague excuse of logistical adjustments. Miss Marple sensed a deeper purpose, as if Raphael's invisible hand had steered them back to the Bradbury Scott sisters' domain. Her handbag, heavy with clues to the rose-edged knife, Elizabeth's sketch, Raphael's card, the Abbey's guestbook entry felt like a map to Verity Hunt's truth. Archdeacon Brobazon's tale of a thwarted wedding had sharpened her focus. Clotilde's love for Verity was a chain, and its breaking held the key to murder. Old Hall's manor loomed behind her, its windows dark save for a single glow in the upper hall. Lavinia Glynn had invited her to stay again, her hospitality tinged with unease, and Miss Marple had accepted, sensing the greenhouse was no mere garden shed, but a vault of secrets. The structure crouched in a neglected corner, its glass panes clouded with grime, ivy snaking across like veins. A faint creak carried on the breeze, as if the door beckoned her forward. She moved silently, her umbrella tapping the ground like a blind woman's cane, though her eyes were sharp as ever. The greenhouse door was ajar, its hinges rusted, and the air inside was thick with the musk of rotting leaves and something sharper chemical, perhaps. Inside, rows of wilted plants sagged in cracked pots, their leaves curling like despairing hands. Miss Marple's flashlight beam danced across the clutter, broken tools, a stained apron, a shelf of unlabeled bottles. Her heart quickened as she spotted a glint beneath a tangle of vines, a silver locket, its chain caught on a thorn stem. She knelt, careful not to disturb the scene, and pried the locket free. Its surface bore a familiar Roseanne V engraving, identical to Anthea's, but inside was a tiny photograph. Verity Hunt, her chestnut hair framing a wistful smile. Miss Marple's breath caught. This was no coincidence. The greenhouse was a shrine to Verity, and its secrets were tied to her death. She slipped the locket into her handbag, her mind racing. Had Clotilde hidden it here, or Anthea? And why? A soft scuff of footsteps froze her. She doused her flashlight and crouched behind a potting bench, her pulse steady despite the danger. Through a gap in the vines, she saw Anthea Bradbury Scott enter, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. Anthea's hands trembled as she reached for a bottle on the shelf, muttering, "It's still here, thank God." Her locket gleamed, and Miss Marple noted the panic in her movements, as if she feared discovery. Anthea left as quickly as she'd come, clutching the bottle. Unaware of the eyes watching from the shadows, Miss Marple waited, then emerged, her mind piecing together the scene. The bottle perhaps poison, and the locket suggested a truth. Buried in this greenhouse, one Anthea was desperate to conceal. She recalled Elizabeth Temple's gasped words, "Not what they say." Verity's murder, blamed on Michael Raphael, was a lie, and the sisters were its architects. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple found the dining room abuzz with the tour group, who had joined for a late supper hosted by Clotilde. The table was set with crystal and silver, but the air was taut, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Clotilde, regal in a black dress, presided with a warm smile, but her eyes lingered on Miss Marple, sharp as a blade. Lavinia sat quietly, her journal absent, her fingers twisting a napkin. Gabriel, the scarred man, ate in silence, his scars stark under the chandelier's glow. Miss Marple steered the conversation lightly, mentioning the greenhouse. "Such a curious place," she said, her tone innocent. "Almost forgotten, yet it feels lived in." Clotilde's smile tightened, and Anthea's fork clattered against her plate. "It's just a relic," Clotilde said, her voice smooth but edged. "Verity used to tend it before." She trailed off, her gaze distant, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of pain or guilt in her eyes. After supper, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, where a housemaid, a young woman with wary eyes, was polishing a mirror. "You knew Verity, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice a soft invitation. The maid, Elsie, hesitated, then nodded. "She was kind, miss, always singing in that greenhouse. But Miss Clotilde, she watched her like a hawk, didn't? Like her with that Michael boy, said he'd ruin her." Miss Marple's heart thumped. Did Clotilde ever act on that dislike? Elsie's eyes widened, and she glanced at the locked door across the hall, the one Anthea had eyed at supper. "I shouldn't say, miss, but after Verity died, Miss Clotilde stopped going to the greenhouse, like it hurt too much." Elsie hurried away, leaving Miss Marple to stare at the door, its keyhole a dark eye. Later, in her guest room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the greenhouse a shadowed bulk below. She opened her handbag, laying out her clues, the knife, the sketch, Raphael's card, the guest book entry, and now the locket. Each pointed to the sisters, but Clotilde's devotion, described by Elsie as hawk-like, cast the longest shadow. Had her love for Verity, twisted by possessiveness, led to murder? The locked door nagged at her, a barrier to answers. A knock startled her. Lavinia stood in the doorway, her face pale. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice trembling. "You're digging into Verity's past, aren't you? Be careful, Miss Marple." Clotilde. "She doesn't forgive those who pry." Her eyes darted to the greenhouse, and Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting a faint flicker of light within, just as she'd seen before. Lavinia retreated, leaving Miss Marple to wonder. Was the light a signal or a warning? She considered confronting Clotilde, but chose patience, locking her door instead. Raphael's words, "Seek justice where love fell decode," and the greenhouse. Locket was a cry from Verity's past. Anthea's furtive visit, Clotilde's guarded eyes, Lavinia's fear. They were pieces of a mosaic, and Miss Marple was close to seeing its shape. The chapter closed as Miss Marple stood by the window, the manor's silence broken by a distant owl's cry. She clutched the locket, its cold metal a promise of truth. "Verity," she whispered, her voice soft but resolute, "your secrets are speaking, and I'm listening." Her heart raced, the steel of Nemesis burning within, ready to face the shadows that guarded Old Hall's heart. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The moon hung low over Old Hall, its silver light seeping through the manor's tall windows, casting jagged shadows across the oak-panelled hall. Miss Jane Marple stood alone, her small figure dwarfed by the towering portraits that lined the walls, each face a silent witness to the secrets buried within. Her handbag, heavy with clues: a rose-etched knife, Elizabeth's sketch, Raphael's card, the Abbey guest book. The greenhouse locket felt like a lodestone, pulling her toward the truth. The locket's photograph of Verity Hunt, found amidst the greenhouse's decay, had crystallized her suspicions. Clotilde Bradbury Scott's love for Verity was no mere guardianship. It was an obsession that had turned deadly. The tour group had departed for a nearby inn, leaving Miss Marple alone, with the sisters at her request, a decision that now set her heart pounding. She'd seen the flicker in Clotilde's eyes at supper, a mix of warmth and warning, and knew the time for subtlety had passed. Raphael's words, "Seek justice where love failed," were a clarion call, and tonight she would face the shadow. At the heart of Old Hall she found Clotilde in the library, seated by the fire, a leather-bound book open on her lap. The room smelled of old paper and wax, the portrait of Verity gazing down like a ghost. Clotilde looked up, her hair catching the firelight, her smile polite but strained. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice rich yet guarded, "you've taken quite an interest in our home. Can't sleep?" Miss Marple's eyes were steady, her voice calm but unyielding. "Sleep eludes those who chase truth, Miss Bradbury. I've been chasing Verity Hunts." She paused, letting the name settle like dust. "I believe you killed her." Clotilde's book slipped to the floor, its thud echoing in the silence. Her face paled, but her eyes burned with a fierce intensity. "That's a bold accusation," she said, her voice low, almost a growl. "Verity was my light, my daughter in all but name. Why would I harm her?" Miss Marple stepped closer, her umbrella tapping the floor like a metronome. "Because she was leaving you," she said softly. "Verity loved Michael Raphael, planned to marry him in secret. You couldn't bear it, her independence, her choice. To break free, you raised her, shaped her, but she wasn't yours to keep. So you took her life, staged it to frame Michael, and let the world believe a lie." Clotilde rose, her tall frame looming, her hands clenched. "You know nothing," she hissed, but her voice cracked, betraying her. Miss Marple held her gaze, her small stature a quiet force. "I know enough," she said. "The locket in the greenhouse, hidden like a confession. Your name in the Abbey guest book, weeks before her death. Elizabeth Temple's warning, silenced by a rockslide. And your sister, Anthea's fear, she wears Verity's initial like a chain. You killed her, Clotilde, to save her from a life you couldn't control." The fire's crackle was the only sound as Clotilde's facade crumbled. Her shoulders sagged, and she sank back into her chair, her eyes glistening with tears or guilt. "She was mine," she whispered, her voice raw. "I gave her everything: home, love, a future. But she chose him, that reckless boy, full of charm and ruin. I couldn't let her throw it all away. I'd stopped her. A draft in her tea, quick and painless. I held her as she slept, forever mine." Miss Marple's heart ached, but her resolve was steel. "You didn't save her, Clotilde. You stole her. And Michael, branded a murderer, lost his life too." Clotilde's sob broke the air, a sound of anguish and surrender. "I didn't mean for him to suffer," she said. "I thought the world would forget, move on. But you're relentless." "I am Nemesis," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but unyielding. "And justice will come." She stepped back, her eyes never leaving Clotilde's, sensing the weight of her confession. The library felt smaller, the air thick with truth unveiled. A creak at the door startled them. Lavinia Glynn stood there, her face ashen, her journal clutched like a lifeline. Clotilde, she whispered, her voice trembling. Is it true? Clotilde's head bowed, and Lavinia's eyes filled with tears. You told me it was an accident, that Verity fell ill. She turned to Miss Marple, her voice breaking. What happens now? Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. The truth must be told, Mrs. Glynn, to the authorities, for Verity, for Michael. Lavinia nodded, her shoulders shaking, and fled the room, leaving Miss Marple and Clotilde. In a silence heavy with reckoning, Miss Marple moved to the window, where the greenhouse's silhouette stood like a tomb. She thought of Anthea, who'd guarded the locket's secret, and Gabriel, whose scars might mark him as Michael, still hiding. Evelyn's evasions, Oliver's suspicions each had played a part, but Clotilde was the heart of the darkness. Raphael. Letter had led her here, to this moment of unmasking. She turned back to Clotilde, who sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the fire. I'll stay until morning, Miss Marple said. The police will come. You'll face what you've done. Clotilde nodded, a broken figure. Her confession, a chain now binding her, as Miss Marple left the library. The manor's shadows seemed to retreat, as if the truth had banished them. She climbed the stairs to her guest room, her steps steady despite the weight of the night. In her room, she opened her handbag, laying out her clues one last time. The knife, the sketch, the card, the guest book, the locket. Each had led her to Clotilde's confession, a step toward justice. She sat by the window, the moon now hidden by clouds. The greenhouse below was dark, its secrets laid bare. She thought of Verity, her life snuffed out by a love too fierce, and of Michael, wronged by a lie. Raphael's trust in her, his call to Nemesis, had been honored. But the final steps delivering Clotilde to justice, freeing Michaela ahead, the chapter closed as Miss Marple whispered to the night, her voice a vow as firm as stone. Verity, your truth is free. Now let justice roll. Her eyes gleamed, with the resolve of Nemesis, ready to see this through to its end. Chapter 10. Justice rolls down. The morning sun pierced the mist over Lichgate, bathing Old Hall in a golden glow that belied its shadowed heart. Miss Jane Marple stood in the manor's gravel courtyard, her small suitcase at her feet, her handbag heavy with the weight of truth, the rose-etched knife, Elizabeth's sketch, Raphael's card, the Abbey guest book, the greenhouse locket, Clotilde Bradbury Scott's confession last night, her admission to murdering Verity Hunt out of possessive. Love had unraveled the mystery Jason Raphael had tasked her to solve. Now, as the air carried the faint scent of dew and lavender, Miss Marple awaited the final act of her mission as Nemesis. She had telephoned the authorities at dawn, her voice steady as she relayed Clotilde's confession to Inspector Harrow, a local officer with a reputation for thoroughness. The police arrived quietly, their car crunching the gravel as they entered the manor. Miss Marple stood aside, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, watching as Clotilde emerged, her tall frame stooped, her face a mask of resignation. Lavinia Glynn followed, her auburn curls loose, her eyes red from tears. Anthea, clutching her locket, hovered at the door, her defiance crumbled into silence. Inspector Harrow approached Miss Marple, his notebook open. You've done a remarkable thing, Miss Marple, he said, his voice gruff but respectful. Clotilde's statement matches yours poison in Verity's tea, staged to frame Michael Raphael. We'll need your evidence, but it's a solid case. He glanced at the sisters, now seated in the police car. A sad business, love turning to murder. Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle but firm. Love can be a chain, Inspector. Verity deserved better, and so did Michael. She handed him the locket, its photograph of Verity a silent testament, along with the knife and sketch, each piece a nail in Clotilde's guilt. Harrow's eyes widened, but he took them without comment, promising a full investigation. As the police car drove away, Miss Marple turned to Lavinia, who lingered in the courtyard, her journal clutched like a lifeline. "You knew, didn't you?" Miss Marple said softly. "Not everything, but enough to fear her." Lavinia's voice trembled. "I suspected, after Verity died. Clotilde was different, colder. Anthea hid things. Letters, that locket, but I couldn't face it. I'm sorry." Her tears fell, and Miss Marple touched her arm, a gesture of quiet compassion. "You faced it now, Mrs. Glynn. That's enough." The tour group, unaware of the night's drama, was preparing to depart from the inn. Miss Marple joined them, her presence unassuming yet commanding. Evelyn Carver, her clipboard discarded, approached, her face pale. "You've stirred something, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "I knew Verity's name haunted this tour, but I never imagined." She trailed off, and Miss Marple sensed her relief, as if a burden had lifted Dot among the group. Gabriel, the scarred man, stood apart, his eyes no longer guarded but clear. Miss Marple approached, her intuition confirmed. "Mr. Raphael," she said, using his true name. "Michael, I presume." He flinched, then nodded, his scars stark in the sunlight. "I hid after they blamed me," he said, his voice rough. "Father believed me innocent, sent me money to disappear. But you've given me back my name." Miss Marple's smile was warm. "Your father trusted me to find the truth. Live well, Michael. That's justice enough." He clasped her hand, his gratitude silent but profound, and boarded the coach. A free man at last. In London, days later, Miss Marple met with the Assistant Commissioner, a stern man with a penchant for clarity, and the Home Secretary, whose presence underscored the case's weight. She presented her findings, her voice calm, as she recounted Clotilde's confession, supported by the clues she'd gathered. The officials listened, their respect evident, and assured her Michael's conviction would be overturned, Clotilde's. Trial swift. A solicitor arrived, bearing Raphael's bequest, £20,000, as promised. Miss Marple accepted it with a nod, already planning to donate it to a children's charity in St. Mary Mead, where Verity's spirit might find peace. Back in her cottage, the familiar scent of lavender, polish, and apples welcomed her. She settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly, the pale blue shawl nearly complete. The village outside was quiet, its rhythm unchanged, but Miss Marple felt the weight of her journey lift. She opened her handbag one last time, retrieving a final note from Raphael, delivered posthumously by his solicitor. "Well done, Nemesis. The scales are balanced." His words, sharp and final, were a benediction. She rose, crossing to her window, where the village green lay serene, under a twilight sky. Verity's face the locket's photograph. The sketch's outline lingered in her mind, no longer a ghost, but a memory at rest. Clotilde's punishment, Michael's freedom, the sisters' reckoning. Justice had rolled down, as steady as a river. Miss Marple thought of Raphael, his trust in her, a gift beyond the money, and of Verity, whose love had sparked this quest. The chapter closed as Miss Marple sat by her fire, the crackle a soft counterpoint to her thoughts. she whispered to the night, her voice a gentle vow fulfilled. Rest now, Verity, your truth is home. Her needles resumed their rhythm, and St. Mary Mead embraced her, the scales of justice balanced, her mission complete.